In 2026, two futures are set for a head-on collision in Africa. One is a story of explosive growth, a continent poised to host more of the world's fastest-growing economies than any other region. The International Monetary Fund sees nations like South Sudan and Guinea hitting double-digit GDP growth, while giants like Ethiopia and Rwanda are surging at over 7%. It's a story of potential of a young, digital native population ready to build, innovate, and lead the world. But there's another story, a darker one. It's the story of a financial bomb set to detonate right in the middle of this African dream. By 2026, countries across the continent must repay their creditors nearly $95 billion. For millions, this isn't just a headline. It's the difference between a hospital having medicine, a school having teachers, or a new road getting built. This is the story of a continent on the edge of a dream and a debt crisis that could turn it into a nightmare. And it all comes down to what happens next in countries like Kenya, desperately trying to hold on, and Ethiopia, attempting a high-stakes escape. So what exactly is this debt bomb? For over a decade, many African nations borrowed heavily to build the future. They funded mega projects, new railways, gleaming ports, and massive power dams. This was the age of ambition, financed by a mix of international bonds, loans from countries like China, and credit from global institutions. Between 2000 and 2023, for instance, Chinese lenders alone committed over $182 billion in loans across the continent. This borrowing wasn't necessarily a bad thing. It was fuel for development. But now the bill is coming due, and it's coming due all at once. The period around 2026 represents a peak in these repayment schedules. A perfect storm of rising global interest rates, a strong US dollar, and slower than expected returns from some of these massive projects has turned manageable debts into a crushing burden. At least 20 African nations are now considered to be in debt distress or at high risk of it. The numbers are staggering. In 2024, African governments were estimated to have spent $163 billion just on servicing their debts, a massive jump from $61 billion in 2010. Think about that. That's money that isn't going into building hospitals, funding universities, or supporting small businesses. It's flowing out of the continent and back to creditors. Today, about 57% of Africa's population lives in countries where debt servicing costs more than social spending. This isn't just an economic abstraction, it's a human development crisis in the making. The very progress that the debt was supposed to finance is now being threatened by the cost of that same debt. The clock is ticking, and for some, the alarm is already ringing. To understand what this crisis feels like on the ground, look no further than Kenya. For years, Kenya was the poster child for African growth, a tech hub, a financial gateway to East Africa, and a nation with boundless ambition. But today, it's walking a razor's edge. Kenya's total public debt has swelled to over 11 trillion shillings. To make that number personal, a report from October 2025 revealed a dire reality. For every 10 shillings of revenue the government collects, nearly 7 are spent just on repaying debt. That leaves only 3 shillings for everything else: salaries for doctors and teachers, road maintenance, and all other public services. In the 2025 budget, debt interest payments were more than double the entire development budget. The consequences are real and painful. When a government is forced to choose between paying foreign creditors and funding its own people, it's the people who lose. It means budget cuts for healthcare, leading to understaffed clinics and medicine shortages. It means less funding for education. It means infrastructure projects stall, and the dream of a modern, prosperous nation gets deferred. One analyst put it bluntly, saying that corruption has turned some public sectors into a killing field where corruption decides who survives. This is the crowding out effect in its most brutal form. The government is so focused on borrowing from its own domestic market to stay afloat that it absorbs available capital. This drives up interest rates for everyone, making it nearly impossible for entrepreneurs to get loans to start a business or for families to get a mortgage. Despite a construction boom, Kenyan banks had only around 30,000 active mortgage loans in 2023, a tiny number for a country of over 50 million people. Kenya represents the great paradox. It has all the ingredients for success, yet it is trapped in a vicious cycle where the cost of its past ambitions is devouring its future. The government itself has acknowledged it might take until 2026 to navigate the worst of these debt repayments, a timeline that leaves an entire nation holding its breath. While Kenya is struggling to stay on the tightrope, its neighbor Ethiopia is attempting something far more audacious. It's trying to cut the rope entirely and build its own bridge. Facing similar debt pressures, Ethiopia has embarked on a radical journey called the Homegrown Economic Reform Agenda. Instead of just accepting painful austerity, Ethiopia is trying to rewrite the rules. Launched in 2019, the plan is a bold mix of strategies. First, it aggressively pursued debt restructuring, successfully negotiating for relief. The government has also stated a strategy of shifting away from new commercial loans and focusing on more favorable concessional loans. Second, it began opening up its long-protected economy. For the first time in decades, foreign banks are being allowed in, and the government launched a new capital market to attract investment. To fight crippling inflation, the central bank also put limits on how much commercial banks could lend. The initial results have been dramatic. For the 2025/2026 fiscal year, Ethiopia is one of the continent's top-ranking countries for growth, with the IMF forecasting an expansion of around 7%. Inflation, once a crippling problem, has started to ease. This isn't just a paper recovery. It's fueling real-world projects, including the controversial but powerful Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, which is set to supercharge the nation's energy supply. But this path is a high-stakes gamble. Ethiopia is still grappling with the aftermath of internal conflict, high living costs, and political instability. Its success is far from guaranteed. It represents a different philosophy, a belief that the way out of a debt crisis isn't just to cut spending, but to fundamentally rewire the entire economic engine for faster, more self-reliant growth. These two nations, Kenya and Ethiopia, represent the two diverging paths for Africa in 2026. One path is a painful, slow struggle for survival under the weight of existing obligations. The other is a risky, defiant sprint for economic independence. The one that succeeds could define the playbook for the rest of the continent. The choice between Kenya's struggle and Ethiopia's gamble is not happening in a vacuum. It's part of a much larger global realignment where Africa's future is being fiercely contested. On one side, you have the promise of unprecedented growth. The IMF has highlighted that Africa will host a majority of the world's high-growth economies in 2026. This is driven by a boom in mineral production, a rebound in oil exports, and a young tech-savvy population of over 1 billion people. The continent's total GDP is projected to hit $3.32 trillion by 2026. But this growth is threatened not just by debt, but by what many argue is an unfair global financial system. A UNDP report calculated that subjective credit ratings have cost African nations an estimated $74.5 billion in excess interest payments. African countries can pay significantly more in interest than they might otherwise, simply due to perceived risk. And then there's China. Beijing has become Africa's single largest bilateral lender, pouring hundreds of billions into infrastructure over the last 2 decades. Chinese-funded projects are everywhere, from railways in Nigeria to ports in Egypt. Proponents argue this has been a game changer, filling a massive infrastructure gap that Western partners ignored. Critics, however, warn of debt-trap diplomacy, arguing that these loans create unsustainable burdens in economic dependency. The truth, as always, is complex. China is both a crucial development partner and a major creditor, making its role in resolving this debt crisis absolutely critical. So what are the solutions? They are as complex as the problem. First, there needs to be meaningful debt restructuring, not just for a few countries, but across the board. Second, the global financial architecture must be reformed to give African nations fairer access to capital. And third, African governments must continue to push for internal reforms, tackling corruption and improving governance. According to Kenya's Ethics and Anti-Corruption Commission, EACC, corruption costs the country an estimated $4.7 billion annually, highlighting that fixing governance is as important as managing debt. 2026 is not just another year, it is a turning point. The decisions made now in the finance ministries of Nairobi, the economic planning rooms of Addis Ababa, and the boardrooms of global creditors will determine whether a generation of Africans sees their dreams realized or deferred. The stakes could not be higher. This is a battle for Africa's future, and the outcome is anything but certain. What do you think is the way forward for the continent? Is the Ethiopian model of radical reform the answer? Or is a more cautious approach necessary? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below.